Under the glow of stage lights, old country music was often seen as the sound of toughness, freedom, and raw honesty. But behind the timeless hits and sold out shows, many legends were slowly losing control to alcohol. What began as a way to cope with pressure, loneliness, and life on the road turned into a silent addiction. Whiskey didn't just fuel the music, it drained careers, families, and lives. Hank Williams. At the dawn of modern country music, Hank Williams rose faster than almost anyone before him. By his mid-20s, his songs were already shaping the sound of American heartbreak. Tracks like Your Cheatin' Heart and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry weren't just hits. They were emotional confessions that felt uncomfortably real. Audiences believed Hank wasn't acting. He was living every word he sang. Behind the success, however, his body and mind were already breaking down. Chronic back pain, likely caused by spinal defects present from birth, followed him everywhere. Doctors offered little relief. Alcohol became his most accessible form of pain management, both physical and emotional. What began as drinking to get through performances slowly turned into constant dependence. Touring schedules were relentless, and no one around him had any interest in slowing things down. As long as Hank kept writing and drawing crowds, the machine kept moving. As his drinking worsened, his reliability collapsed. He missed radio shows, arrived drunk to concerts, and sometimes couldn't perform at all. The Grand Ole Opry, once the ultimate symbol of success, dismissed him for unprofessional behavior. For most artists, that would have been the end. For Hank, the hits continued anyway, recorded in bursts of brilliance surrounded by chaos. His talent was undeniable, but so was the damage alcohol was inflicting. Personally, his life unraveled just as quickly. His marriage failed under the weight of addiction and emotional instability. Friends described a man swinging between warmth and deep despair, often self-medicating rather than seeking help. At the time, alcoholism was seen less as an illness and more as a personal flaw. There was no system to protect him from himself, and no one willing to shut down a profitable star. On January 1st, 1953, Hank Williams was found dead in the back seat of a car on the way to a New Year's Day concert. He was only 29 years old. The official cause involved heart failure, worsened by alcohol and prescription drugs. The country music world was stunned, but quickly moved on. His records sold even more after his death, cementing his legend while erasing the reality of how badly he had been failing. Hank Williams didn't just die young. He became the blueprint for a recurring tragedy in country music. Immense talent, unchecked addiction, and an industry that looks away until it's too late. George Jones. If Hank Williams created the blueprint, George Jones became the longest and most painful chapter of it. Widely regarded as one of the greatest voices country music ever produced, Jones could deliver heartbreak with a level of control and emotion that few singers could match. Songs like He Stopped Loving Her Today turned him into a legend. Yet behind that voice was a man locked in a decades-long war with alcohol. George Jones did not simply drink on the side. Drinking became the center of his life. By the height of his fame in the 1960s and 1970s, alcohol dictated his schedule, his relationships, and his reputation. He was notorious for missing shows, sometimes vanishing for days, while promoters and fans waited in vain. The nickname No Show Jones followed him everywhere, a cruel joke that masked a serious addiction spiraling out of control. The industry knew exactly what was happening. Venue owners, managers, and record labels watched him self-destruct in real time. Yet as long as his records sold and his voice remained intact, very little changed. Tours continued, contracts were renewed, the chaos became part of the myth rather than a warning sign. Alcohol wasn't stopping the machine, so the machine refused to stop him. His personal life suffered deeply. His marriage to Tammy Wynette became one of country music's most public tragedies. Their relationship was marked by emotional turmoil, fear, and instability driven largely by Jones's drinking. Stories emerged of paranoia, violent behavior, and near-total isolation. At his lowest point, Jones reportedly drank so heavily that he once rode a lawnmower to a liquor store after his wife tried to stop him from driving. Health problems mounted. Hospitalizations became frequent. His voice, once flawless, began to weaken under years of abuse. Yet even as his body deteriorated, moments of brilliance continued to appear. That contrast made his story even more painful. George Jones wasn't losing his talent, he was losing the ability to survive it. Unlike many others on this list, George Jones did not die young. He eventually found sobriety later in life, but only after decades of damage had already been done. By then, many bridges were burned, and much of his life had been spent in recovery rather than joy. George Jones stands as proof that survival does not always mean victory. Alcohol didn't kill him quickly. It took his time, his peace, and nearly his legacy, one drink at a time. Johnny Paycheck. Johnny Paycheck built his reputation on rebellion. His voice was sharp, defiant, and perfectly suited for the outlaw edge that country music flirted with in the 1970s. When Take This Job and Shove It exploded into a working-class anthem, Paycheck became a symbol of anger, frustration, and refusal to obey. On stage, he sounded fearless. Off stage, he was unraveling fast. Alcohol was not a background habit in Johnny Paycheck's life. It was a driving force behind his volatility. Heavy drinking fueled a personality already prone to paranoia, aggression, and poor impulse control. As his fame grew, so did the chaos surrounding him. Bar fights, violent outbursts, and erratic behavior became routine. Promoters learned to expect trouble. Band members learned to stay alert. The industry learned to tolerate it because the records still sold. Unlike some of his peers, Paycheck did not hide his demons behind poetic sadness. His addiction played out loudly and publicly. Alcohol mixed with other substances intensified his unpredictability, and the line between performance persona and real behavior disappeared. What fans saw as outlaw authenticity increasingly looked like self-destruction. Shows were canceled. Relationships collapsed. Trust evaporated. The breaking point came in 1985, when Johnny Paycheck shot a man during an argument at a bar. Alcohol was a central factor in the incident. He was convicted and sentenced to prison, a fall from grace that shocked even an industry accustomed to excess. For a time, his career seemed finished. Radio distanced itself. Labels lost interest. Country music quietly moved on. After his release, Paycheck attempted a comeback. There were moments of sobriety and flashes of the old talent, but the damage was irreversible. His health declined rapidly. Years of alcohol abuse had taken a toll on his body, particularly his liver. Financial problems followed him until the end, a bitter contrast to the success he once enjoyed. Johnny Paycheck died in 2003 at the age of 64 from complications related to liver failure. His death received far less attention than his rise or his scandals. Today, he is often remembered for one iconic song, while the deeper story is rarely discussed. Paycheck's life shows how quickly rebellion can turn into isolation. Alcohol didn't just amplify his anger, it stripped away his chances for stability, redemption, and peace, leaving behind a legacy defined as much by chaos as by music. Lefty Frizzell. Long before country music embraced the outlaw image, Lefty Frizzell defined what it meant to sound effortless and natural. His smooth phrasing and relaxed vocal timing changed country singing forever, influencing generations of artists who came after him. At his peak in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Frizzell was one of the biggest stars in the genre, selling records at a staggering pace and commanding national attention. But fame arrived quickly, and structure never followed. Alcohol became a constant companion almost as soon as success did. Touring schedules were punishing, expectations were endless, and Lefty lacked the discipline to protect himself from excess. Drinking began casually, then habitually, and eventually destructively. Unlike some artists who used alcohol to numb emotional pain, Frizzell often drank simply because it was always available and rarely discouraged. As the years passed, alcohol started to interfere with the very thing that made him famous. His once fluid performances became inconsistent. He showed up late, unprepared, or not at all. Record labels grew frustrated. Promoters lost patience. In an industry that valued reliability above loyalty, Lefty slowly fell out of favor. Younger artists, many of whom idolized him, replaced him on the charts. Physically, the damage was severe. Heavy drinking led to declining health, repeated hospitalizations, and eventually a series of strokes. His voice weakened, his coordination suffered, and his ability to perform vanished piece by piece. There was no dramatic scandal, no explosive downfall. Just a quiet erosion that few people outside his inner circle seemed to notice. Financially, the consequences were just as grim. Despite once being one of the highest-earning names in country music, poor management combined with addiction left him struggling. Medical bills piled up. Opportunities dried up. The industry that had celebrated him during his rise offered little support during his decline. Lefty Frizzell died in 1975 at the age of 47 after suffering a massive stroke. By then, his influence far outweighed his recognition. Artists like George Jones openly credited him as a defining inspiration, even as Frizzell himself faded from public memory. His story is a reminder that alcohol doesn't always destroy careers in a dramatic explosion. Sometimes it works slowly, quietly, and relentlessly. Lefty Frizzell didn't lose his legacy overnight. He watched it slip away while the world moved on, leaving behind a sound that shaped country music and a life that never recovered from its excesses. David Allan Coe. David Allan Coe entered country music from the margins, and he never tried to hide it. Long before Nashville embraced the outlaw image as a marketable brand, Coe was already living it. His background was chaotic, his reputation dangerous, and his music raw to the point of discomfort. Songs like You Never Even Called Me By My Name made him famous, but they only hinted at the instability that defined his life behind the scenes. Alcohol was deeply woven into Coe's identity. For him, drinking wasn't just a coping mechanism or a touring habit. It was part of the persona he presented to the world. Bars, biker clubs, late-night recording sessions, and endless road miles created an environment where excess was not only accepted but expected. The more outrageous he appeared, the more authentic he seemed to certain audiences. That illusion came at a cost. As his career grew, so did his self-destructive behavior. Heavy drinking intensified already volatile tendencies. Coe became increasingly unreliable, confrontational, and isolated from the mainstream industry. While other outlaw artists eventually learned how to balance rebellion with longevity, Coe refused to compromise. Alcohol reinforced that refusal, blurring judgment and deepening conflicts with labels, promoters, and fellow musicians. The consequences were gradual, but severe. Radio support weakened, industry relationships collapsed. His controversial material, combined with erratic behavior fueled by alcohol, pushed him further outside Nashville's protective circle. While his influence remained undeniable, his opportunities shrank. Financial instability followed, despite years of success and name recognition. Physically, the damage accumulated quietly. Decades of heavy drinking contributed to declining health and repeated hospitalizations. By the time Coe began to step back from the spotlight, much of the industry had already moved on. Younger audiences knew his songs, but not the man. Older fans remembered the legend, not the wreckage left behind. Unlike many on this list, David Allan Coe did not die young. But survival did not mean peace. His later years were marked by health struggles, reduced mobility, and isolation from the mainstream success he once rejected with pride. Alcohol did not destroy him in a single dramatic moment. It worked slowly, reinforcing every bad decision and amplifying every conflict until the damage was irreversible. David Allan Coe's story shows the darker side of outlaw mythology. When rebellion becomes identity and alcohol becomes fuel, there is no safety net. What looks like freedom from the outside often becomes a cage from the inside, one drink at a time. Townes Van Zandt. Townes Van Zandt was never built for the machinery of fame. From the beginning, his songwriting carried a quiet gravity that set him apart from mainstream country. His lyrics were intimate, fragile, and painfully honest, reflecting a mind that was constantly searching for meaning while battling deep inner darkness. Among fellow musicians, he was revered as a genius. Among the wider public, he remained largely invisible. Alcohol entered his life early and never truly left. Unlike artists who drank to celebrate success, Townes drank to survive himself. He suffered from severe depression and bipolar disorder, conditions that were poorly understood and aggressively mistreated during his lifetime. Electroshock therapy in his youth left lasting damage, and alcohol became a way to dull emotional pain that never stopped resurfacing. What started as self-medication slowly became dependence. As his addiction deepened, stability became impossible. Townes drifted between couches, cheap hotels, and temporary shelters. Touring was inconsistent. Recording sessions were unpredictable. Producers and labels admired his talent, but hesitated to invest in someone who seemed unable to function within any structure. Alcohol didn't just limit his career. It reinforced his isolation, keeping him on the outside even when his work deserved far more recognition. Physically, the toll was devastating. Years of heavy drinking weakened his body and compromised his immune system. He suffered frequent illnesses and hospitalizations, often returning to alcohol immediately afterward. Friends tried to help, but Townes resisted intervention. For him, sobriety felt more terrifying than destruction. Alcohol had become both his enemy and his refuge. Despite everything, his creativity never fully disappeared. Songs continued to emerge, stripped down and haunting, often written during periods of intense loneliness. Artists like Willie Nelson and Emmylou Harris covered his work, turning his compositions into classics, while Townes himself remained financially unstable and largely forgotten by the industry. The contrast was brutal. His words traveled the world, but he stayed behind. Townes Van Zandt died in 1997 at the age of 52, not from a dramatic overdose, but from complications tied to years of alcohol abuse. His death passed quietly, almost fittingly, without the recognition his influence deserved. Only afterward did his legend grow, celebrated by musicians who understood just how rare his voice had been. Townes Van Zandt's story is not one of explosive collapse. It is a slow, aching erosion. Alcohol didn't silence his talent. It surrounded it with loneliness, poverty, and pain, until survival itself became the hardest song he ever tried to finish. Keith Whitley. Keith Whitley's rise felt like destiny. By the late 1980s, his voice carried a rare blend of vulnerability and strength, echoing the emotional honesty of earlier legends while sounding unmistakably modern. Songs like Don't Close Your Eyes and When You Say Nothing at All positioned him as the future of country music. He wasn't just successful, he was trusted by audiences who believed every word he sang. But long before fame arrived, alcohol was already present. Whitley began drinking heavily as a teenager, and by the time Nashville embraced him, addiction had become deeply rooted. Early success only masked the problem. Studio performances were brilliant. Interviews were charming. Behind closed doors, however, drinking was constant and escalating. Those closest to him understood the danger, but the momentum of his career made intervention difficult. As his fame accelerated, so did the pressure. Expectations grew, touring intensified, and the demand to deliver hit after hit became relentless. Alcohol turned into a daily coping mechanism. Whitley struggled with sobriety, cycling through short periods of control followed by devastating relapses. The industry watched nervously, but as long as his voice remained flawless, concern rarely translated into action. Unlike some artists whose addictions played out publicly, Whitley's decline happened quietly. There were no major scandals, no arrests, no dramatic walkouts. He continued recording, he continued performing. Yet friends noticed his health deteriorating rapidly. His body was failing under the strain of constant drinking, even as his career appeared to be peaking. In May 1989, Keith Whitley was found dead in his home at the age of 34. The official cause was acute alcohol poisoning. The news sent shockwaves through Nashville. Only months earlier, he had been celebrated as the genre's next defining voice. Suddenly, that future vanished. Posthumous releases topped the charts, turning his death into a cruel contradiction. The success arrived just after he was gone. Whitley's passing forced uncomfortable conversations within country music. For a brief moment, addiction was acknowledged as a real and deadly problem rather than a personality quirk. But the industry's reflection was short-lived. Tours continued. Young artists faced the same pressures. The cycle resumed. Keith Whitley represents one of the most painful what-if stories in country music history. Alcohol didn't slowly erode his legacy over decades. It ended it in a single night, cutting short a career that had barely begun to reveal its full potential. His voice remains timeless. His absence remains a warning that arrived far too late. Faron Young. Faron Young was one of the brightest stars of country music's golden era. In the 1950s and 1960s, his smooth voice, polished image, and string of hit records made him a staple of radio and television. Songs like Hello Walls placed him at the center of Nashville's commercial success, and for a time, he embodied everything the industry wanted. Handsome, reliable, and endlessly marketable. But behind that carefully maintained image, Faron Young was struggling with demons that fame could not quiet. Alcohol became a constant presence in his life, as success intensified the pressure to remain perfect. The touring, the expectations, and the need to sustain a public persona left little room for vulnerability. Drinking offered temporary escape, but it slowly deepened an emotional instability that had been present long before stardom. As the years passed, the charts began to change. Younger artists emerged, sounds shifted, and Farron Young's dominance faded. For many performers, this transition is painful but manageable. For Young, it was devastating. Alcohol consumption increased as his relevance declined. He struggled to accept that the industry he had helped build no longer needed him in the same way. Depression settled in quietly, often masked by humor and professionalism in public appearances. Unlike some country stars whose addictions led to chaotic scandals, Young's decline was subtle. He continued working, investing in music publishing, and mentoring younger artists. From the outside, he appeared stable. Internally, however, the combination of alcoholism and severe depression was tightening its grip. Friends later recalled mood swings, hopelessness, and a deep sense of disconnection from the present. By the mid-1990s, the weight became unbearable. On December 10, 1996, Farron Young took his own life at the age of 64. The act shocked Nashville, not because his struggles were unknown, but because they had been underestimated. Alcohol had not destroyed his career outright. It had hollowed him out over decades, numbing pain while quietly amplifying despair. In the aftermath, the country music community mourned him as a pioneer, yet discussions of mental health and addiction remained limited. His story was often reduced to a tragic footnote rather than examined as a warning. The industry honored his contributions, but the circumstances that led to his death were largely left unaddressed. Farron Young's life shows that alcoholism does not always end in public collapse or early death. Sometimes it works slowly, alongside depression and loss of identity, until a person who once had everything sees no future at all. His legacy lives on in classic recordings, but his ending remains one of the most sobering reminders of what success cannot save. Mel Street was never meant to be a superstar in the traditional sense. His voice didn't rely on polish or spectacle. It carried quiet pain, the kind that resonated deeply with listeners who lived far from the spotlight. During the 1970s, songs like Borrowed Angel and Lovin' on Backstreets made him a respected name in classic country circles, especially among fans who recognized authenticity when they heard it. Behind that authenticity, however, was a man fighting a losing battle with alcohol. Street's career developed in an era when emotional vulnerability was admired on record, but discouraged in real life. Touring was constant, money was unstable, and the pressure to deliver honest heartbreak night after night took a toll. Alcohol became his refuge, a way to dull anxiety and self-doubt that never fully went away. As his dependence deepened, consistency became harder to maintain. Performances fluctuated. Some nights he was magnetic, delivering songs with devastating sincerity. Other nights, alcohol interfered with his focus and health. The industry, already shifting toward newer sounds, offered little patience. Unlike bigger stars, Street did not have the protection of powerful managers or major label backing. When problems emerged, support faded quickly. Financial stress compounded the situation. Despite chart success, Mel Street never accumulated real security. Royalties were modest, touring income was unreliable, and medical expenses mounted as his health declined. Alcohol abuse weakened his body and intensified his depression. Friends noticed changes in his mood, growing hopelessness, and a sense that he felt trapped between fading relevance and unrelenting personal struggles. In October 1978, Mel Street died by suicide at the age of 42. The news barely registered outside dedicated country circles. There were no massive headlines, no extended public mourning. His death was treated as a sad but isolated incident, rather than the culmination of years of addiction, exhaustion, and neglect. Alcohol had not taken his life directly, but it had played a central role in eroding his stability and ability to cope. After his death, Borrowed Angel took on a haunting new meaning. The song's themes of loneliness and desperation felt less like performance and more like confession. Fans who revisited his music began to recognize how closely his art mirrored his reality. Yet even then, Mel Street remained largely forgotten by the broader industry. Mel Street's story represents one of the quietest tragedies in country music history. Alcohol did not destroy him in public scandal or tabloid headlines. It worked in silence, stripping away confidence, financial security, and hope until the weight became unbearable. His voice endures as a reminder that some of the most honest artists suffer the most and are remembered the least. Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings represented defiance in its purest form. He wasn't just part of the outlaw country movement, he helped define it. With his deep voice, unapologetic attitude, and refusal to bend to Nashville's rules, Jennings became the symbol of artistic independence in the 1970s. To fans, he looked untouchable. To those close to him, he was slowly destroying himself. Alcohol was a constant presence in Waylon's world long before fame fully arrived. Touring culture, long nights, and the pressure to stay rebellious made heavy drinking feel normal. As success grew, so did the excess. Whiskey flowed freely, often alongside other substances, blurring the line between lifestyle and addiction. For a time, it seemed manageable. He kept recording. He kept selling out venues. The machine kept rewarding him. But behind the scenes, control was slipping. Alcohol fueled volatility and deepened an already strained relationship with the music industry. Jennings was fiercely protective of his independence, but drinking magnified every conflict. Arguments escalated, trust eroded, health warnings were ignored. In the outlaw image, self-destruction was often mistaken for authenticity, and Waylon leaned into that myth. Physically, the toll became impossible to hide. Years of heavy drinking and substance abuse weakened his body and compromised his immune system. Hospitalizations became more frequent. Friends noticed drastic changes in his energy and focus. Even as he publicly rejected Nashville's constraints, his addiction quietly imposed its own brutal discipline. Unlike many on this list, Waylon Jennings survived his most destructive years. In the early 1980s, faced with serious health scares and the real possibility of losing everything, he made the decision to get sober. It was not a clean or heroic transformation. The damage had already been done. His body carried the scars, and his career never fully returned to its earlier momentum. Sobriety brought clarity, but also regret. Jennings later spoke openly about the years lost to addiction and the relationships damaged along the way. Alcohol had not taken his life, but it had consumed time, health, and opportunities that could never be recovered. The outlaw image remained, but the cost behind it was no longer hidden. Waylon Jennings' story complicates the narrative of survival. He is often celebrated as a success story for overcoming addiction, and in many ways he was. But that framing can obscure the deeper truth. Alcohol nearly erased him, and it permanently altered the course of his life and legacy. His experience exposes one of country music's most dangerous illusions, that rebellion has no consequences. Waylon Jennings lived long enough to tell the story, but only after coming closer to the edge than most ever realized. Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash projected strength. Dressed in black, standing still at the microphone, his voice carried authority, conviction, and moral weight. To audiences, he appeared unbreakable, a man who sang about sin, redemption, and justice because he understood them from a distance. The truth was far less controlled. Alcohol played a critical role in unraveling the life behind that image. Cash's relationship with drinking intensified during the early years of his success. Endless touring, isolation, and the pressure to remain productive created a cycle of exhaustion. Alcohol became a nightly ritual, a way to come down from the stage and quiet a restless mind. Over time, it stopped being occasional relief and became daily dependence. Whiskey did not replace his discipline overnight. It slowly eroded it. As his drinking worsened, it opened the door to heavier addictions. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, blurred judgment, and made prescription drugs feel manageable. What followed was a spiral that nearly destroyed everything he had built. Arrests, canceled shows, and erratic behavior began to follow him. His reputation suffered, and the industry that once relied on his dependability began to see him as a risk. Personally, the damage was severe. His marriage collapsed under the weight of addiction and emotional distance. Friends described a man oscillating between deep guilt and reckless behavior. Alcohol amplified his self-loathing, which in turn fed further abuse. Despite his public image as a moral figure, Cash privately felt like a failure, trapped between who people believed he was and who he feared he had become. By the mid-1960s, his career reached a breaking point. Record sales dropped. Radio support weakened. He was banned from venues and dismissed as unreliable. At one of his lowest moments, Cash wandered into the desert near death, a physical manifestation of how far he had fallen. Alcohol and drugs had stripped him of structure, stability, and purpose. His survival came through intervention, faith, and the unwavering support of June Carter. Sobriety did not come easily or instantly, but it marked a turning point. Cash rebuilt his life slowly, confronting the damage rather than hiding from it. Unlike many others, he was granted time to repair his legacy. Yet the scars remained. His health never fully recovered, and the years lost to addiction could not be reclaimed. Johnny Cash is often remembered as a redemption story, and rightly so. But focusing only on the recovery risks, ignoring how close he came to complete erasure. Alcohol did not simply accompany his downfall. It paved the way for it, weakening defenses and accelerating destruction. His story stands as a rare exception in country music history. Not because he fell, but because he was given the chance to stand back up. Blaze Foley lived on the absolute edge of country music, far from the safety nets of Nashville and commercial success. He was never a star in the traditional sense, but among songwriters, he was something rarer, a cult legend whose raw honesty felt almost dangerous. His songs were deeply personal, stripped of polish, and filled with loneliness, humor, and quiet desperation. Fame never arrived, but hardship did, and alcohol was never far behind it. From the beginning, Foley's life was marked by instability. He drifted between small towns, broken-down houses, and friends' couches, carrying little more than his guitar and his songs. Alcohol became part of his daily existence, not as celebration, but as survival. With no steady income, no industry support, and no sense of belonging, drinking filled the empty space left by constant rejection and poverty. It dulled the frustration of watching his talent go unnoticed. Unlike artists protected by success, Blaze Foley had no buffer. Alcohol worsened his vulnerability, leaving him exposed in unsafe environments. He performed in bars, lived with strangers, and depended on people who were often just as unstable as he was. His drinking made him trusting to a fault, unable to recognize danger or remove himself from it. Friends later described him as kind, gentle, and painfully naive, qualities that alcohol only magnified. Creatively, his addiction didn't silence him. Some of his most haunting songs were written during periods of deep isolation and heavy drinking. Tracks like Clay Pigeons carried a quiet resignation that felt less like songwriting and more like confession. Other musicians recognized his brilliance and recorded his work, achieving success with words he never benefited from himself. Blaze remained poor, overlooked, and increasingly fragile. The end came suddenly and senselessly. In 1989, Blaze Foley was shot and killed at the home where he was staying, following an argument fueled by alcohol. He was 39 years old. There was no fame, no comeback, no recognition waiting on the other side. His death barely registered beyond a small circle of musicians who understood what had been lost. Only after his death did his reputation grow. Albums were reissued. Documentaries were made. Younger artists discovered his music and spoke of him with reverence. But recognition came too late to matter. Alcohol had not directly pulled the trigger, but it had shaped every condition that led him there. Poverty, exposure, and an inability to protect himself. Blaze Foley's story is one of the harshest in country music history because there was no rise to soften the fall. Alcohol didn't take him from fame to obscurity. It kept him trapped in obscurity until violence ended the story entirely. His legacy survives through songs that sound like final letters, honest, unfinished, and painfully human.